Jackson here. As we get ready to get started, thank you guys for joining us today. We're going to get started. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin the webinar. This is a student-centered approach to personalized learning. This webinar is being recorded and it can be viewed later. My name is Carl Hooker. I am the host. I'm also a few other things. I'm here in Austin, Texas, as some of you heard that came in. I'm an educational consultant, speaker, former classroom teacher, former administrator, do a little bit of everything, written a few books. I even DJ and do trivia nights just for fun on the side. But today I'm very excited because I get to be the moderator of an amazing panel. And so what I'm going to ask our panelists to do is when I show their intro slide, I'm going to ask them to come on camera and introduce themselves. And again, for those of you before we get started, if you're interested, if you have questions, things like that, we hope to interact with you as well. So as we post questions to the panelists today, we invite you to as well contribute into the chat. We always like to hear what our participants are doing. We want to keep this as a very active conversation amongst all of us. And there will be an opportunity to answer some questions at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to get us started. Agam, why don't you go ahead and come on camera there. Tell us who you are and where you're joining us from.
Hello, everyone. This is Agam Altiev. I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. I work at Bliss Academy, a public charter school here. My background is math. I did math in college. I'm math teacher, math coach, math director, coordinator for the district. Now I am the director of entire academics, and I also work with McGraw-Hill to do personalized learning. I'm a data scientist on the side. You know, I do a lot of data work. I started data holistic reporting, multiple assessment reporting back in before pandemic. So welcome.
So if anybody has any math problems, we've got our expert on the panel for this and anything about data. I love all the perspectives that are joining us today. Dylan, why don't you go ahead and come on camera as well? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a learning scientist and former startup co-founder. My startup did personalized learning, big data, machine learning stuff, was acquired by McGraw-Hill last March. So now I'm VP of Learning Scientist in McGraw-Hill.
That is one of those titles that didn't exist probably a while ago, right? It's one of those jobs that didn't exist as our kids are getting older. And Julie, come on camera, tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Julie Neisler. I'm a quantitative researcher from the Learning Sciences research team at Digital Promise. I'm also our privacy officer. My background is in post-secondary research and thinking about how do we use the data that we're already collecting to promote equity for our students and garner student success.
Yeah, as you can see, guys, this is a very well-versed and very knowledgeable panel. And we have finally rounded us out. Vic, go ahead and close us out on our panels here.
All right, just coming on. Hi, everybody. My name is Vic Vucic. Great to meet you all. I'm actually based out of Menlo Park, but currently outside of Philadelphia in Swarthmore. And I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Digital Promise, and I was founder of the Learner Variability Project, which is a huge synthesis. It's actually a learner-centered synthesis of learning sciences research to really help us understand and support the full diversity of learners. And interesting note, prior, I spent 7 years at the Hewlett Foundation and headed up a lot of their open education work and helped launch a lot of the open educational resources that are out there if you're a user of those.
I love the wide range and variety of expertise that we have today on our panel. And I see that Julie already has a fan, as Nick has already gave her a shout out there. Julie is the GOAT. Okay, so the bar has been raised there, Julie, for you to start us out. But we're going to get into this, guys. And I think what's interesting is because all of you have this kind of unique lens, or in some ways, somewhat of a shared lens when it comes to data. I think that's a word and a phrase that we use a lot in education. How do we use data to help with learning? And so we're going to tackle this from a few different angles, but also even in the title of this webinar, we're talking a lot about personalized learning. So I think people that are signing in, and we have over 100 attendees right now, are coming to, they've heard this idea of personalized learning, and we've heard this topic discussed over the years, and it's somewhat buzzwordy. But what I want to ask you guys right now is, and we'll start with Dylan on this one first. What is different about this conversation that we're about to have, this conversation we're talking about now today about personalized learning, than maybe what we've talked about in the past?
Carl, you're right. It is definitely a buzzword. In fact, I think about 5 years ago, Michael Horn, who's also on the advisory board of the Learner Variability Project with me that Vic runs, wrote an article about how the term had sort of hit the peak of the hype cycle. That was 2017-ish. And after that, there's this trough of disillusionment. And then you kind of get back into something reasonable and more modest in your claims and more realistic in your outcomes. I think that we're entering into that space. People have been trying to do personalized learning stuff with technology for like 100 years. And it's, there are some clear ways in which it's obviously working and other clear ways in which it's totally overblown and not at all doing what people claim. But I think now we are in a position where computing power, storage, digital exhaust have all risen. Expectations and overblown claims about being robot tutors in the sky have been clearly put away. And there have been some pretty significant historical jolts to the system that have opened people's minds to the need to move beyond a one-size-fits-all approach and to be more flexible and accommodating with different needs for different learners who have different goals and different contexts. So I think there's a lot brewing right now.
Kind of hitting that sweet spot, like you were saying, where technology is finally able to kind of support what we're really thinking and imagining of this idea of an IEP for all, right? Everyone has their own kind of personalized path with education. Vic, what do you think has been some of the drivers of this change, or what's really changed the landscape in education when it comes to personalized learning?
Yeah, I think it's a great follow-up. There are kind of two things that really jump out. It's funny, around 7-8 years ago when personalized learning really kind of burst out and was the hot buzzword, often I'd ask in a room full of people, okay, so what exactly are we personalizing and based on what research? And often the room would go quiet and say, well, we're just personalizing whatever we can. And it was very much kind of this hacking approach of like, hey, we can personalize this or that or this or that. And yet there's a huge body of learning sciences research where we understand actually based on the research, how learners vary and what are some of the key areas that really have a big impact. And so I think, and at the Learner Variability Project, we spent a huge amount of time and created these open source models, synthesizing that. There you go. You can see the slide. It's a little blurry, but I'll just, you can go to lvp.digitalpromiseglobal.org after the webinar, or pull it up in a separate tab. And really for the purpose of personalization, these are the hotspots that research shows really impact learning outcomes that learners vary on. And then there's a whole database of strategies with research behind them to support that. And then there's been other efforts as well in terms of how do we synthesize and make all this research more actionable and more learner-centered and with a lens towards equity. The second thing I will say that really shifted over the last 5 years, and especially over the pandemic, is much more of a focus on the whole child and the whole learner. That it's not just the academic content and where you are on a math pathway, but it's actually, how do you feel about math learning? Do you have math anxiety? Do you see yourself represented as a mathematician? Do you have, are you a English second language learner where the academic language is making you struggle? Where things beyond just, oh, you need to do more operations right now and just keep doing more operations until we get to the next thing. So that whole learner lens really opens it up to the factors actually that research show really matter in supporting and driving learning. And I've seen a big shift in the field and the work that's happening to bring that broader lens and really that stronger basis on the learning sciences research as we're going forward.
So Julie, Vic kind of hit this a little bit when he was talking about some of the changes that we're seeing in the research and talking about that holistic view of what a child is. And I love that you mentioned that, Vic, because I think you're right. And math is a perfect analogy of this, because math seems to be the one that's like, people either say I'm a math person or I'm not a math person, or, and there's a lot more to it than just that. So Julie, let me ask you this: how's the technology and the research kind of advanced? Would you say that you've seen over your career in terms of what we're getting in terms of data points now with this?
Yes, I mean, so the data we're collecting is vastly greater than what we've been able to do before, right? With our back-end data, I think we're able to capture this data that we're already having, and we're now working with those learning scientists to dig in. And I think similar to what Vic talked about when he looked around the room and said, what are we personalizing? I think one of the things that I think as I walk around the room and said, where are the students? If this is student-centered learning, where are the students that you are centering, and how are you including students in that research? And so I think before it was, oh, hey, here's this product, give us your feedback on it. But research has now been expanded to really honor students as the experts of their own experience and bringing them in throughout the entire R&D cycle of thinking, what are you trying to do? Like, what should this product be trying to support you in? How is this going to help you learn? Like, what content should we do that is personalized to your cultural backgrounds and experiences? And so I think the research has changed and really just bringing in more stakeholders and doing this more rapid cycle R&D so that we can get good products that are actually helping students in front of students faster.
And I think before we go on to the next one, because I'm going to get to Agam on this next question, I do want to hit, John just asked a great question in the chat, and maybe Dylan, you can kind of help define this. What exactly is a learner scientist?
Learning sciences is an interdisciplinary field taking from educational psychology and computer science and cognitive science. And it's really broad. There are learning scientists who focus on learning at the level of milliseconds, like cognitive neuroscience style. And there are learning scientists who focus on learning on the scale of decades, sort of lifelong learning and how our identity changes across the time and there are learning scientists who focus on individual clusters of neurons and on whole communities of people. So it's a very diverse set of interests within a space of research focusing on the learning process and learning communities and learning contexts. Sometimes, but not always, learning science includes thoughtful consideration of environments and how to make those environments more conducive to learning. And that can be social and technological and sort of cultural. So there's a lot of variability. If you read learning sciences literature, you'll get ethnographers and technologists all contributing. But at base, that's what learning sciences is.
I'm excited. Learning science, when you hear it, it's like, well, that's is it a deep subject? But I mean, everything you just explained there, I mean, the amount of different levels and nodes that kind of go into the research that you're talking about, it seems like it can be, and I also love that you mentioned the longitudinal lens of it, because I feel like sometimes in education, we're so focused on the current and the present that we don't think about growth over time, or like you're saying, the lifelong learner. We say that phrase a lot, but do we actually mean it when we're talking about what we're researching? Agam, I'm going to get you on this one. We're going to start on this next question because I want to ask, we're kind of going through, I mean, a lot of people right now know that there's a lot of upheaval in education and in our space, whether it be higher ed, K-12, especially when it comes to like teacher retention and just kind of teacher burnout in general. How do you feel like what role does personalized learning play in that? And I know a lot of teachers may be on this right now wondering like, wow, this is another thing I need to do. It's another thing that's added to my plate. But is it something that can actually help them as well? So Agam, why don't you start us out with this one? Because right now we're in the middle of this kind of crisis. We don't know exactly where education is heading, especially here in the US. So how does personalized learning play a role in that?
So, I work on the field. I'm a director. Even though I'm in the office, I'm half day in the campuses, going to the teacher classrooms and, working with the teachers and coaches. So when we call personalized learning, in other words, that comes to us, is a differentiation, which is one of those words that teachers get tingles when they hear, I have to differentiate. I have to do all these different materials for my students. It's literally very hard for teachers to visualize the differentiation part. On the other hand, the personalized learning, the way we implement it or way it's being, promised, it's one of, you can call it a teacher aid. I call it like an assistant teacher. I see teachers working with only 2-3 students who really need attention, and personalized learning takes care of differentiation for the entire rest of the classroom. So teachers, instead of dealing with 25 students, they only deal with 3-4 students academically and socially too. Having one-on-one interaction really helps students build it, make them grow. So that's the part that I really believe in personalized learning, and the way I have been using it for teachers to stress less on trying to differentiate for every single student and let the personalized learning take care of it. And it's been happening through there are different softwares out there that's used. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to call out, but that you guys are probably using it. But what I'm really looking forward with the McGraw-Hill and working with Dylan with McGraw-Hill too, making it available on actual curriculum textbooks, being able to personalize through the textbooks. Right now, textbooks are traditional, static work, but how about it's more dynamic, changing based on students' needs.
That's what I'm excited about with this conversation, because you're absolutely right, Agam. That's been part of the bugaboo of textbooks, is that they're printed, they're put on the back of the shelf, and they sit in a classroom for 10 years. And that's
even on the digital format too. On the digital, it's
right,
just a PDF or things. But how about we personalize for the students on the students' grade level material?
right. That dynamic content. That's an exciting thing. Vic, let's kind of keep on this topic of personalized learning, but let's talk about also the teacher side of this. So, the students, obviously they get a personalized experience, but with teachers, you're going to have some level of variability, meaning that some teachers may implement this with some fidelity, some may not, maybe just be trying their best, and maybe there's some tools they can grab with this. So how do you address that concern of like, maybe that each experience, obviously every experience is going to be different based on the teacher. So how do we address that and still kind of deliver a personalized learning experience? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, there we go.
Had to do it at least once. There we go.
I break the ice.
Yeah.
So, there are a couple of key things. One thing that we see, what's interesting with the Learner Variability Project, is we created actually an adult learner model around how adults vary and how they learn. And what we found is really powerful is actually when we do professional development with teachers, we start with that for themselves and say, look, think about how you vary and learn, and look at what's here, and all of a sudden it resonates. It's like, oh my God, yeah, I do struggle with some aspects of cognitive, executive function, or I do feel strong in these areas, and they see their own variability. And one thing that does is also then bringing the respect for the teaching profession. I mean, what we've seen over the last few years is like, not only does the whole learner matter, but the whole teacher matters too.
Right.
There's a lot, right? And it is this thing. We can't just jump in and be like, oh, change everything, all this, a lot of it's like, oh my God, just get me back to some sort of sanity. So, stepping in with that lens of adult learner variability, and then really empathizing and designing for the learners. We have these 4 key areas, the academic domain, the cognitive, which is kind of executive function, things like working memory and attention. There's social emotional, which is the psychological factors, and then diverse background. And what I always say is, the goal is not to personalize on 32 different dimensions for all 42 of your students, in real time. Pick, something in all 4 areas that you're supporting your students in an integrated fashion. And there are strategies like a graphical organizer, or maybe, other, there is this kind of 2 and 10 strategy, or other strategies that you can pick a few that cover a lot of these areas, and can help create that sort of broader support in the classroom. And then I will just say, I do think this is what's going to be evolving over the next 8 to 10 years. It's funny, my former boss, Karen Cater, we were kind of reflecting back on the field, what's changed and what's the future. And we said, well, the last 10 years was how do we get people to use technology, and in the classroom, and how do we get that to happen more, and this and that. Well, now that's happening, and that's everywhere. But now teachers and administrators have 1,500 apps that they're bombarded with. Oh my God, I have this one and that one and this one and that one. And how do I integrate this with my curriculum and my pedagogy and all that? And I think that's what the next 10 years is. And that's what, you see things like some of the McGraw-Hill work and others that are, how do we now integrate this and make this coherent and simpler, so that it's not just, oh, I have 32 different dashboards and I don't know how this fits in the curriculum and all this stuff, even though I am using the technology.
That alone makes me stressed. I mean, as a former administrator who managed, I think over, I don't know how many hundreds of apps in our district, it was, eventually you're like, okay, how do we see that everyone's using it? How do we know they're using it right? Julie, how do we take all this technology and try to and use it in a way that's not just noise? In other words, it helps us kind of along this path of personalized learning, because there's lots of tools out there you could use, and you can do, you could do anything, but you can't do everything, right? That's kind of the expression. And with teachers right now who are feeling kind of this crisis moment of stress, we want to reduce that as much as we can. So how can the tech, do you feel like, how can that help us kind of go down this path of personalized learning without overwhelming them?
Are you asking me to answer the question that Vic said we have an answer to in 10 years from now?
Yeah, I want you to answer it now. So
okay.
It's now 2032, and Julie's going to tell us the answer to the 10-year problem.
Okay.
No problem. Softball.
Oh, okay. Well, in this place, I can't be wrong. So what I think about in terms of equity, right? Equity is students having access and being able to use the resources to get them where they need, to the support they need to be successful. And so if you think of personalized learning, that is each individual student filling that gap. of finding, the just-in-time remediation that I need, the culturally responsive material that I need, something that helps alleviate my math anxiety or presents information in a multimodal way, right? And so being able to close these little individual student equity gaps, I think allows us to see that big picture, or see those changes over time. How we go about interacting or making interoperable 1,500 different apps, I have no idea. That seems like a worthy endeavor for the brave among us. But I think once we can figure that out and really start to build this culture of using data to drive our decisions, particularly when it comes to students and their personalized learning in their past, I think we've got to really, what's it called, leapfrogging. We're going to leapfrog some of these current crises that we're dealing with.
Well, and I do think we're on somewhat of that path, with IMS Global and some of these ideas of getting some sort of succinct, and Digital Promise has done a lot of work on this too, in terms of saying, let's go ahead and do some vetting. Let's go ahead and try to get some interoperability, because I think, as John points out in the chat, sometimes we fall prey to the shiny tool. And maybe it's not what's best for kids. Maybe it's just this nice new thing that we want to try out with our students. So Dylan, on the technology side of that, do you think, and again, since we're going crystal ball anyway, I'll go ahead and do this to Dylan too, sorry, but thinking to the future, Dylan, is there a chance that you think that technology can help us kind of bridge that gap that we see a lot of times between students when it comes to the social needs or emotional needs, any type of behavioral challenges, things like that? Do you think that there's an opportunity for that to happen with technology in the future?
Absolutely. If the only signal that we're getting about students is proportion correct on assignments, then all of our choices about how to differentiate or personalize to accommodate those students have to be based on those narrow academic measures. But as we start to see opportunities to capture and better understand where students are with respect to a more holistic picture, referring back to the Learner Variability Project's framework, you've got the academic stuff, but you've also got domain general cognitive stuff, you've got social emotional stuff, you've got student background stuff. If you can get a richer sense for where a kid is, not just they're struggling with 2-digit multiplication, but they tend to be really anxious, they have auditory processing troubles, and they have been getting bad sleep recently. You know a lot more as an instructor about how to help that kid, how to support that kid, where that kid is and why, and what's the right move to make to support that kid. There are increasingly many digital interactions that students can take advantage of that will help them express where they are on lots of different dimensions, not simply my understanding of this concept dimension. And responsible learning science and data science can make use of those signals to help make a more complete picture of the learner, and use that more complete and holistic picture along with research validated strategies like those that the Learner Variability Project makes available to suggest the right next step in supporting that learner.
It almost sounds like Amazon to me in some ways, the whole, like, we know that you have these interests in these particular things, and maybe this is something else that you might be interested in, almost a playlist in some ways, which could be seen as good and bad. The AI there can help us. But I also think, back to your point where you're just saying about those background interests, I think as a teacher early in my career, before I had the technology tools, it still came down to, do you know what the kid is interested in? Do you know what their background is? Can you connect with those interests and then help them motivate themselves to kind of learn, like you're talking about 2-digit multiplication or whatever it is. So I still think that's kind of at the core of it. Now we have these extra data points. Agam, I'm going to go to you on this, because I think we're kind of looking at this now. As Dylan just mentioned, we're getting all these data points now. So we have lots of data coming at us. And I've heard this phrase used a bunch of times. We're data rich, but information poor or action poor in certain ways, because we do have lots of data points. And I think people point out in the chat sometimes too much data too, in some ways. So how do we take, how do we translate the student learning data and actually turn it into something actionable in terms of that personalized learning approach? Not just saying, okay, we see now that you did poorly on these assessments, so therefore next time we're going to change the assessment and do this, this, and this. What are some things that teachers out there listening or administrators out there listening can do to kind of interpret that data and turn it into something actionable?
So for teachers and administrators, and also, for educational programs that are providing, like McGraw-Hill, Digital Promise, and all others too, being able to provide the data to the teachers, I think that's the main thing. We ask teachers to be data-driven, but in the most cases, when we say data-driven, we are asking teachers to create their own data. Most of the time, raw data is the one that's been thrown out to them. without colors, without dynamic, without shapes or figures, and they're supposed to make up something with it and drive it. So we should be able to let the teachers drive the data and let the machines, computers, create the data for them, make the data for them. So quick example, like I said, I'm the data guru in my district, and when I was math coordinator, I would provide my entire school's data to my teachers. My teacher, let's say in parent-teacher conferences, I don't want them hunting down different softwares, try to provide, hey, your kid has this many discipline problem. His grade is this on math grade, or he got this grade on the benchmark or NWA testing. So why not I provide them? So I submit so many, I called it multiple assessment, holistic reporting. I put discipline report, grades, benchmark, national assessment, and state assessment on one really student-friendly language with figures, colors, and make it a little bit more dynamic so it shows how did it grow over the quarter, over the year. So parent and student has great conversation over it. So teachers driving the data in that way. So I think that's the main thing, that all of those data has to be provided to the teachers instead of keep asking them, just handing them out and, hey, you make your own stuff.
It makes me think that too, Agama, are there other people? I feel like your position is so needed in schools, but a lot of times, a lot of schools don't have it, have the advantage of having someone like you in that role. Do you know of other schools that have similar positions, or what are schools doing to kind of bridge that gap?
Unfortunately not. There are some, titles called data coordinator, but it doesn't really do that unless, people really pick up. It's from my personal interest. I'm not supposed to do it, but I like it and I feel the need and I see how it helps the teachers. Now I'm thinking, especially in this discussion, I believe schools need a data scientist, not a coordinator or not someone just making stuff, a data scientist who can make a great data like in the private sector does.
Yeah, changing that role of textbook coordinator to data scientist. And of course, it helps that you're also, you said you have a passion for it. So talk about personalized right there. I mean, you're taking a passion of something that you like and then using it to actually help your school and your constituents. Julie, looking at the data that we're getting, and Agam mentioned it there somewhat, sometimes teachers are gathering this data too, and it can be, the quality may be affected based on who's gathering the data and how it's being interpreted. So why does it matter, first of all, that we have high quality data? I mean, can we just get these little numbers and on a spreadsheet and figure it out and make a pretty chart with reds and yellows and greens?
I think it matters because if we're using the data to make decisions about students, we should have good data. And so I think, that means a lot of different things. Are we collecting data from lots of different types of students, right? So if I'm, talking casually to students and getting some information, oh, this is how you're doing, this is how you're struggling, am I talking to enough students? If I'm looking at these dashboards that are provided through personalized learning, if it's signaling engagement, what is engagement actually measuring? And making sure that the recommendations that we're giving to these students or these changes, these interventions that we're going to do based on this information is on good, reliable data that's actually measuring what we want it to measure, right? Because if a student's saying, oh, I'm super engaged, but it's actually just that I'm really anxious, so I'm clicking around the whole time, and then the signal isn't actually able to be captured, then that's not necessarily good data. So making sure that what's being measured and that you can use how it's being measured in a way to guide your interventions and your changes that you want to do with that data.
So, and that gets me to my next question for you, Dylan, too, is so taking the points that Julie just made and saying, okay, now let's say that we agree that the data is high quality, or it's a good quality data. How do I then take that data as a teacher? And you guys mentioned parent-teacher conferences is what Agam mentioned, using that, using some sort of intervention, putting that into action, and let's put ourselves in the day of the life of a teacher who's now I've got this interesting data. I know something about this student. Now, how do I take action on it in a day-to-day basis?
That's the main goal of the work that the Center for Innovation within McGraw-Hill Plus is working on. It's called McGraw-Hill Plus, and the hope is that we'll make it so that we don't have to have a data scientist in every school. Although if you did, it would be fantastic. We want to bring together data from lots of different student experiences across programs into one place. So instead of looking at 5 different dashboards, you're only looking at one place that gives you, as holistic as possible, a sense not only for where a student is, but for what the right next step might be for that student. We have a design goal of always providing actionability. So not just, hey, this kid's in the 67th percentile. I don't know really what to do with that, but you know, this is what this kid is working on. This is where there's a gap in understanding, or this kid is totally okay with this. So maybe they're ready for an extension activity, et cetera. We always want to ease the teacher's workflow and coordinate the classroom, rather than give teachers one more thing that if they were true heroes, they could go and do, like Agam was talking about. Take these CSV files, bring them all together, all the data are at your fingertips, if you have another 40 hours in your week to make sense of it all and decide what the right next step is.
Well, and I think that also makes me think about this, the other side of this coin. And Vic, I'm going to ask you this question, because I think I mentioned the Amazon reference earlier as I was talking to Dylan about, oh yeah, the points, the endpoints, it's going to kind of come up with some suggestions, or maybe we're getting a lot of data that's coming from lots of different inputs. But you know, students are a lot more than just data points, right? There's a lot of nuance there that goes into that. And so I guess my question for you, Vic, is how do we balance that, or how do we take into consideration all of the other factors that go into play when you see that kid made a 67th percentile, for instance? How do we kind of meld that all together to turn it into something that we can actually use with our students on that personalized experience?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important and that often gets missed is actually the first step is kind of the mental model. Like, what is the mental model that either a teacher or a school has in terms of the learner and how they want to understand them, and then how they want to support them? And, you know, if that's just literacy scores, that's a really narrow, you know, mental model. But that's where the whole learner aspect really sort of opens up that space. And I think it goes also for designing products. So many products are adaptive products, and they're just very linear. And I'll even say we launched a product certification on learner variability. And one thing we found was, in the beginning, when we piloted it, the products came and just put everything in the academic column. That's what they were focused on supporting. And then we eventually said, you know, we don't care about the academic column. Everyone's already doing that. What's the question is the cognitive, social, emotional, and the diverse backgrounds. What are you supporting there? So we shifted it. And then one math product came to us and said, well, we're a math product, so why are you making us think about social emotional learning? And I said, well, that's exactly the conversation we need to have then right now. Math is a social emotional process in terms of learning it. And you should think about it in an integrated fashion. And that's what we need products to do. And I kind of draw the analogy that but also not to overwhelm. You don't need to be an expert on everything. I often draw the analogy. If you want to drive from San Francisco to New York, it ends up you don't need a map. You can type it into Google Maps. You get on ramp of I-80, you drive for 48 hours, and you get off in Manhattan. But obviously, there's 1,000 other ways you can drive across the country. And you know, if you're into barbecue, we should go down to the south and hit Austin. If I'm into sports teams, hit up north and do this. If I get a snowstorm in Tahoe, I'm not going to be expert on all 1,000. But if I don't even know they exist, if they aren't part of my mental model, then I don't even know to look for them, or that it may be a possibility or something. And then, you know what, if I do think it's important, then I can go and ask the learning specialist or someone else, or, you know, the math coach, or this or that. And so that's where setting up that mental model, both in practice as well as in product design, I think is the first step. And then the goal is to understand the learners and support that understanding as richly as possible through whether it's diagnostics, assessments, observations, and other things that are. And then what can I do with it? What should I do with it, right? And that's kind of the recommendation piece. And so I think if you take that holistic approach and do it transparently, not a black box, and with equity at the center to make sure you have diverse, you know, learners and contexts as a part of this, then you can kind of really step into this in a really powerful and safer way. But if we take a narrow thing of, you know what, 67 percentile literacy, we need to get them to 75%. All we care about is their decoding skills. And you know what, we have this one algorithm that's going to serve, you know, all 50 million students. And we've just tested it out in this tiny school, and we're going to roll it out to everybody, and everyone gets the exact same professional development, and we go. Like, that's not going to work.
Right. I love that too, the analogy of that road trip too, because it makes me think of also, like, you know, we've tended to a lot of times in academics, especially, take a spotlight approach to things. We're going to focus our light on this one little point. What you're saying is more of a lantern, right? We get to see all the light in the room. We get to see all the factors that are kind of leading up into this, and then using that to actually lead us to action. We're gonna we got a couple more questions to go, but before I go any further, I've seen some of you are dropping questions in the chat. I may lose it in the chat, so I would encourage you guys, if you want to have a question answered by the panel before we get to the end, go to the Q&A feature and drop it in there so I can make sure I can find it, because there's a lot of good things that are being posted in the chat. Very active chat. Thank you to our panelists for also participating in that. Dylan, we're gonna go back to you on this this fourth question. And we talk about we've talked a lot about the factors that influence all of this in some ways. And in this case, student learning data and student learning differences are, we're not saying they're hand in hand, but they definitely have some interaction with each other. And so when we talk about all these factors, like, what does that really mean? What does that really mean? Because I think someone even asked early in the chat, like, what does it mean, personalized versus differentiation? And I think you had a good response to that too. So how do we take all of this now information and actually put it into some action when it comes to these two things, data and differences?
We want to broaden the range of learning relevant data that we can collect responsibly and make well-warranted inferences from. So that includes paying attention to a wider range of student activities, even as straightforwardly as in the example I gave in the chat about a great product called Heartbeat that Schmoop has come up with. Just asking kids, how do you feel? How are you feeling? Have you been getting good sleep recently? Have you gotten any fights with your significant other, or you eating right, that kind of stuff? Those are the kinds of questions that will give kids an opportunity, if they want to express things that might be causing them a little additional headache or struggle. Or they might be like, man, sometimes people will do fist to five, especially in elementary classrooms, like, how are everybody feeling today, right? Yep. So there are kids who are coming in, they're like, I'm pumped right now. And there are other kids who are like, I'm not feeling so good right now. I don't want to do anything. So broaden the set of things that you consider to be learning relevant data. And the Learner Variability Project is like that breadth that they're demanding people pay attention to is really helpful in that respect. And then learning differences. One of the strongest trends in public education in the last, 40, 50 years is the increase in variability, the increase in diversity within classrooms, and it's all over. It's more backgrounds, more languages, a greater range of variability in terms of cognitive and social maturity and readiness and all that, like just more, more variability, more difference. And you can take the kind of sheltered, do what I can approach where you're like, there's like 6 kids I can make a difference with this year. I'm going to focus on those 6 kids. Or if you're building a product, I'm going to build for that middle of the bell curve, and I'm just going to not so much accommodate these others. But one of the most powerful things that the Learner Variability Project makes clear is that you can accommodate that wider range of variability with thoughtful design choices at the beginning, so that you don't have to, cut off the ends of any kind of curve. You can instead design to support people who are way over at one tail, way over at another tail. And there are so many different distributions that you couldn't possibly design the one thing that's going to be just right for in the middle for everybody. But if you design things to be better able to accommodate wider ranges of differences, and you collect more data along more dimensions to better understand where people vary, then you're better equipped to meet everybody where they are and help them get where they want to go. Which, by the way, is one of the distinguishing features I mentioned in the chat, but I'll mention it again now, between the way some people talk about differentiation and personalization. Differentiation is the goal is here, but people could take different paths to get there. Personalization might also include more of a sense that, like, your goal, Carl, might be different from Julie's goal, which might be different from Vic's goal. And that's totally cool. And we want to support you guys in getting to where you want to go. So there's more of an agency on the part of the learner. Where do I want to go? Where do I want to take my learning goal, my learning career, rather?
And so to follow up on that, Vic, how do those differences, those learner differences, how do they affect, when we think about students, how does that actually come into play when I talk about the learner outcomes? All of us may have different goals. And so that's going to look differently in a classroom, because we're not all trying to hit that same high water mark that we've said, as Dylan says, like that middle of the bell curve part. So how do those differences play in this?
Yeah, so a couple angles. First is, as Dylan was talking about, one of the concepts that probably some people here know is universal design for learning as well, where there are a handful of core practices that really broaden how much you support across your learning environment or your classroom. And recognizing, as I said, teachers have been personalizing in the classroom since the start of teaching by making choices and helping guide their different students in different ways. It's just that technology is helping us do this in new and broader ways. Sorry, so then touching into learning differences, I will say one huge goal of the Learner Variability Project is really showing this map that everybody has variability and helping to destigmatize this. It ends up, dyslexia is actually just variability in 4 of these factors, that we're all on various parts of the continuum on these 4 or 5 different factors. Same thing with, what's called autism or other things. And so, this is all just variability in how we learn. It's actually universal across everybody. And then, when it gets to the outcomes, I think one really, really important thing is, and this is something it's been important to be really explicit about, is yes, we want to personalize learning, we want to tailor outcomes, but a key practice is maintaining high expectations for all. It can't be that like, we're just going to drop the bar for these groups of kids or these kids or whatnot. Because yes, we have flexibility in that now, but really it's been shown through research that, high expectations and having high expectations of kids, actually, they usually rise to it. If you have high supports with high expectations, then yes, they do rise to it. And actually everyone is capable. And so that is something that's really important as we step into this kind of world of kind of more flexible learning. And then just stepping back, the whole notion that every kid should learn the exact same thing in the exact same place, the exact same way, at the exact same time, when we live 85 years of development of brain, the brain, oh, you're not going to learn this at this moment in 5th grade and blah, blah, blah. Now you're done and behind and falling behind forever. Like, it's crazy. Like we do develop differently, and we need to support that in our systems. And now we're starting to be able to do that better and better.
See, now you're starting to go off the rails. See, now you're talking about multi-age classes and year-round school, and it's going to be cats and dogs living together. Big. Yes. But yeah, when you put it that way, why do we think that? Why do we think that we have to learn a certain thing at a certain time in a certain place? And we come back to those differences, Julie. Can we actually measure differences, or is it quantifiable? Is it something we can actually say, this is something we're going to measure? And that aspect is everything measurable.
So I would like to think everything can be measurable, but not everything should be measured. So one of the examples I think of, so somebody Parnika asked in the chat about privacy and ethics, right? So I saw a pitch for a pilot of, we want to use wet or face tracking while people do math to see at what point their face turns to a cringe or a face of frustration, and at what point, and then use that as real time, being able to discern how a student's doing and what they're feeling. And I was like, that is lovely. But are you telling me that you want to track as young as 5-year-olds watching every facial movement they make while they do this work? And I think that might be a bit of an overreach, maybe, in terms of the data you need to collect about your students. And so I think there's a line of what can be measurable is great, but keeping, what Agam said of these tools, they need to be usable and they need to support teachers, right? And if they're not supporting teachers, if they're not centering equity, if they're not helping students move along their personalized instruction, then we shouldn't measure that difference. If it's going to violate, ethics and privacy, then we shouldn't measure that difference. And so I think it's important to think about what is the usefulness, the practicality of the differences that we're trying to, denote and learn. And so neurodiversity is a great example. SEL is a great example. But, might be differences. Is difference in typing speed? Does that matter? Sure, it might slow down and you might say, I look longer, but is that a difference we really need to address in the classroom if we're talking about math? And maybe not. And so I think being really intentional and conscientious of what you are measuring and then what you are doing about those differences, right? Because differences are there to say, this is where you need extra support, not to explain, that's why you didn't do very well. That's not helpful for anyone. And again, we're trying to be helpful and center students, center equity, and support teachers. And so I think as long as we keep those things in mind, the differences that we matter or the differences that we measure are going to be good and crucial for our work.
Yeah, I love that. And you kind of touched on what Parnika mentioned in the Q&A. And I'm going to open this up to the rest of the panel too before we get to our final question, because we have a minute for a couple of audience questions here. She asked, as you stated there, Julie, what about the privacy and ethics when we talk about using these data points? And I think it's hard because sometimes we in education, we fall prey to a lot of the things that are happening around us too commercially. And so we know, of course, with Facebook and with all a lot of companies, there's a lot of data capture that's happening, and it's being utilized in certain ways, maybe for financial gain or business gain, things like that. So sometimes we get lumped into that. But there's also, we're dealing with students, and so we have to deal with FERPA and COPA and all of these different compliances that we need to make sure that we're attending to. So maybe Agam, you can hit this too, because you're using a lot of student data in your school to inform. Because what's that line look like in terms of that privacy and ethics? I mean, how do you I guess communicate it with your community in terms of what you're using the data for and how you're using it?
On the line of privacy, we follow the protocol, we adopt the FERPA rules, and there are several apps like Power BI from Microsoft, and there are some others. You can put rules on it, so only people who are teaching or responsible with certain students, they use it, and that's where we also make our holistic reporting available to our staff too.
Any other thoughts, Dylan or Vic? You want to jump in on that idea, that line of data privacy, Dylan?
Absolutely. There are 2 points that I want to make. One is to Julie's earlier point about maybe we shouldn't be measuring certain things. One of the dangers of measuring and accumulating as much as you can is that if you don't have the right framing on it, a certain measurement can be an excuse to write off a kid. Like this label gets stuck on this kid's head, and then everybody just sees that label and they're like, yeah, I'm not going to help Dylan. He's low verbal, so he's never going to get this. So now it's a reason not to support Dylan instead of insight that will help you better support Dylan. In terms of privacy and data security, there was a recent pretty big breach in New York because of a company not doing what it needed to do and encrypt at rest. So I think it would be fantastic if there were a lot more, number one, accountability on the part of all of the vendors who are acting as school officials, because that's how all this stuff happens. It gets through FERPA, right? Like we can act as a school official. We're doing things that otherwise a human in the school system would have done. But there needs to be that level of deserved trust on the part of the school system that this vendor is going to make the kind of responsible choices that data this valuable and sensitive deserve. I also would love to see, and I don't know how to make this happen, but I'd love to see a shift in the way we think about these data as not belonging to the district even, but belonging to the families. So if you took a picture of my kid, you couldn't then put it on a Wheaties box, because we'd be like, but that's my kid's picture. That doesn't belong to you, even if you took that picture, right? And the kinds of data that we're collecting about learners now, as Julie said, over the past 10 years, we're collecting a lot more data. There's a ton more being spit out about everything kids are doing, how they're grimacing in math class and all kinds of stuff. They're like, there's a company that puts halos on kids' heads and measures what they're when they're paying attention and when they're not. All that stuff. It gets to a point where, in a sense, that is an image of that kid. The more holistic and complete a representation it becomes, the closer it becomes to the analogy of the photograph, where it really should belong to the family. It shouldn't belong certainly to a vendor or even to the school district, but it belongs to that individual. And this isn't true just for educational data, Facebook and all the rest of it. So I would love for there to be a policy shift where the expectation is the family owns those data. And those data, especially the sensitive data, social, emotional, student background, that kind of stuff, cognitive stuff that could get a kid labeled, should only be used with explicit, not just like general end user license agreement consent to like, yeah, I agree, you're going to measure all kinds of things and do spooky stuff, but specifically like per use case. Hey, we think that we could better support Dylan if we understood his auditory processing skills, because research has shown that kids who have struggles with auditory processing struggle with certain aspects of decoding, let's say. Could we use this measure to better understand where Dylan is along the spectrum so that we could deliver this specific result of a better support for his learning? And only with that explicit permission could you then do that stuff. And you don't just like write it and keep it in your back pocket and now you know that forever. You've used it for that time and boom, that's it. Now, there's a ton of infrastructural and policy work that would need to happen to make that happen, but that's the direction I would love to see us going in.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect direction. And again, you're right. The policies, the people behind it, that's going to be the tricky thing there. And Vic, do you have a follow-up on that too? I want to hear your 2 cents on this, because you guys do a
Super
lot of work
quick.
in this realm. Yeah.
Yeah, we do, super quick, and I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Julie, who knows a
Okay.
lot more than I do. But there is a student data privacy pledge, which is there, and we encourage companies to sign those and to build the capacity in the market and the field to help create the signals. And just echoing that intent of use, capturing data for sake of capturing data is not a good enough excuse to capture data. Right? The intent matters. Now, Julie, go for it. What's more important than that? I know you know.
I think the most important thing that Dylan mentioned is consent. Getting consent to use students' data. And I think part of that is showing what you're going to use the data for and then sharing it back with students, right? You have given me this data. You filled out this SEL survey about how you're feeling, and I'm going to do something with it, right? Because Vic mentioned capturing data for data's point. That is unethical, to take data and then do nothing with it. You know, you were just wasting people's time gathering their data, but doing something using with it, but then sharing it back. And so I think that's part of the consent. It's part of a continuous improvement cycle. It's part of building trust with the people who are giving you data, and saying, I'm going to share my data with you so that we can all make sure that I learn better. And I think, again, that consent piece is key across the board.
And I think we're balancing as educational institutions, the things that Dylan mentions, those breaches, when those happen, the immediate response a lot of times in the community is, let's pull back, let's not share, let's keep all that kind of private, which could actually hinder the kid. So it's that balance again. I keep hearing that word again, but that's a big part of it. We have a final wrap-up question that I'm actually going to tie in because Julie Curtis asked a question also in the Q&A that I think kind of ties to this final question. And I'm going to give all of you, y'all have about, we'll say 1 minute to think. So I'll give you a second to kind of think about it. So I'm going to tie in professional learning as a part of this. So what can educators and educational leaders do to move closer to this vision? We talk about the data, the use of the data, the actionable use of the data toward personalized learning, the holistic child, all of that. And then what role does professional learning play in this? Because I think it's going to be a big role, but how is there anything out there where we can do this? Because I don't know that there's people out there just doing, I mean, you guys are obviously amazing. And so we'd love to hire you and bring you into our schools to help with this, but where do we get this? Where do we get the support for this to kind of help teachers realize the importance of it and then move forward in action on it? So I'm going to start, Vic, I'm going to let you go first on this one. And that gives everyone else a little bit of time. I was trying to stump as long as I can. I'm going to give you, okay, yeah, 60 seconds on the clock. How do we get to this vision?
All right, so we'll start, first is that mental model of the whole learner, and then finding ways to step into this. And my tagline for my team, and when I work with people, is how do we respect the complexity of learning, but represent with actionability, right? How do we make it actionable so it's not just a theory or something like that? And so there are tools, the Learner Variability Project, I encourage you to look. It's all open source, and we're building courses and micro-credentials and things. But just finding ways, try to build in 1 or 2 more supports for social, emotional, and maybe diverse backgrounds, over the next few weeks. And continue to sort of respect and safely understand your learners better, and finding ways to support them.
Awesome. Agam, what you got? How do we get to this vision?
I have just a practical kind of solution, and I'm also trying to implement too. First of all, the digital platforms that does personalized learning, they will never take the teacher's role. So, relying on them 100% is not a good idea. Kind of an alert, pitfalls, educators have to be careful. There are a lot of personalized learning programs out there. Some of them, let's say you have a 5th grade student, they have to do 2nd grade material. So how come you expect 5th graders to perform in the 5th grade level ever, right? If they keep doing from lower. So right now they call it accelerated learning. You can look for it. It's kind of a new trend, accelerated learning. My second suggestion is, let the teacher sit in the student's role. Let them play those games. Let them complete those assignments. See them so they can feel the student. I do this personally, and I see great benefit. I use McGraw-Hill for my textbook and my personalized learning. So I make my students sit in the desk and solve those questions. So then they realize and they appreciate how much students put effort into it. And the personalized learning becomes more meaningful for them, and they don't resist much.
Love it. Okay, Dylan.
I would say that leaders, whenever they're talking to service providers, vendors, product developers, et cetera, should demand and expect for those vendors to be able to tell them how their offerings would empower teachers rather than marginalize them, and ease their daily workflow and coordinate the classroom. There was a question in Q&A about what do we do about districts that don't have all the resources, right? So the offering needs to be simple enough. It needs to say true things that make it easy for a teacher to better understand how to personalize, rather than there's this incredibly high bar, and if you have a degree in data science, you're set, and otherwise you're kind of SOL. And it should be on the service providers to make it that easy.
Yeah, I like that kind of pushing some of that. It's a shared ownership model, and that's what we're talking about, I think. And as you mentioned, one of the questions in the chat talked about how do we do this, because not every school is gonna be able to afford it, but maybe there's a future where the private organizations bear some of this weight as well, like you just mentioned, Dylan. All right, Julie, home run hitter, come on.
Home run. Okay, so my advice for how to get to this vision, I would say first be intentional in your decisions. Some way people mentioned, oh, the new shiny app in the chat. Don't go for the new shiny app, be intentional. Also on the flip side of a GOMS, why don't you have the students sit in the role of the teacher, right? So if you're thinking about bringing a new technology into your campus, into your classrooms, have students try it out. Let them play with a couple of the different ones that you're thinking about, and seeing what actually meets their needs, right? Because it needs to meet both the teacher's needs that you're supporting and also the student's needs as the learner. And then last but not least, can't lose on ending on equity, center equity. Think about the assets that your students have, that you as instructors have, and then do your best to support them in whatever ways that you can, whether that be a new product or being intentional about how you're thinking about it, or asking a couple questions about SEL and bringing that into your practice, or co-ownership in terms of how things are administered and disseminated throughout your district. Yeah.
I am excited about the future, and I usually don't say that because lately I've been very pessimistic because of all the talk we hear around education, but I want to say thank you to these 4 amazing panelists. Guys, give it up for them in the chat as well. Thank you all for your time, your dedication to the craft of education, and all the work that you've been doing in the areas of learning science. I want to thank McGraw-Hill and Digital Promise as well for being a part of this conversation. Agam, for doing all the work that you're doing there at Lisa Academy too, just kind of sticking with it. And I love that you're someone who's passionate about this. If we could take you and clone you and then figure out a way for the organizations, as Dylan said, to pay for it, I think that would be great. That's what we're kind of heading for in some ways. But yes, thank you all so much again. If you want more information about McGraw-Hill, of course, there's mheducation.com. We also have in the link in the chat there, I think we had a spelling error there, but you got it. All right, Vic, you got it. Perfect. lvp.digitalpromiseglobal.org is where you can find more information about those dashboards and the information that Vic shared earlier. Sorry we didn't get to every question, y'all, but we did hit the hour right on the money. So thank you so much again. And this, again, has been recorded. You'll be able to watch it in its entirety at a later date. Thank you all so much, and have a great afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you live. Thank you, everybody.